a chess tournament in a few days, and I haven't played chess really in 8 months. So, like trying for a test, I was just trying to remember all the old lines I used to play, and there's this interesting one against the London that I haven't really seen anywhere else, and it's pretty simple, so I'm just like to show it. So d4, d5, bishop f4, c5, e3, and now we just want to take it to a carlsbad structure with taking the pawn. I don't know why this isn't more popular, or why I didn't see it on like any chessable courses or something, but it's pretty straightforward. Black's going to play knight c6. Next move, if we're allowed, we're going to play bishop f5 or bishop g4. So for example, knight f3, black plays bishop g4, c3, e6, knight d2. We're just going to develop bishop d6, queen d6. Next we're going to play knight d7, and we have a totally fine middle game as black. So if we go back, instead of knight f3, I could try to challenge this a little bit more. Something like bishop d3. Instead of allowing bishop g4, white could play c3. Here, we can play bishop f5, the alternate square for the bishop. Now, for example, knight f3, queen b3, hitting the b7 pawn, which we left loose. Queen c to defend the pawn. Knight d2, bishop e7, bishop b5, knight f6, knight e5, and castling, and black is totally fine. If instead of knight f3 here, bishop b5 is played, trying to put more pressure on black. For example, e6, knight f3, wanting to go knight e5. Bishop d6 is an important detail, so that now after knight e5, we can play knight g7. After bishop d6, if white takes on d6, we just take back and again play knight e7, and black's totally fine here too. Bishop d3 is kind of complicated. It stops both bishop f5 and bishop g4, but it hangs the d4 pawn. So now knight d4, taking the pawn. White very often blunders here with bishop h7. We play knight e6, hitting the f4 bishop. White takes on g8, we take on f4, they take on f7 with check, king f7, queen f3, hitting the knight to the king. We play e5 to defend the knight. They play g3 to hit the knight. And here we play bishop f5, aiming for this skewer here. They take our knight, bishop e4. If instead knight c3, we hit the knight, knight e2, queen a5, and queen d5. Queen protects the knight, and black is much better here. So after bishop d3, white's best move. So taking d4, white's best move is to play knight f3. When black just retreats and develops the king side naturally, and is much better. So we've done with several moves. Maybe one of the most natural ones for white is to play bishop b5, trying to directly attack this knight. We again play bishop f5, knight f3, e6, and now white's going to apply pressure with knight e5. We meet this with knight e7. White castles. We play a6 to hit the bishop. Bishop c6 is the best move. If the bishop goes back, we can play queen b6 to hit both d4 and b2, and black is better. So white's best move is to take on c6 when we can take back, and black is totally fine here. So what else could white even try here? I think the last move to check is c4. When we follow Ben Feingold's rule of always take. And now bishop c4 is not possible because of queen takes d4 and black's up a pawn. So instead knight f3, we defend our pawn with bishop e6. And white has a few options here. So for example, knight c3, trying to play d5. We just play knight f6. White develops bishop e2, knight d5, taking over the square, hitting the bishop on f4. Bishop g3, g6, castling bishop g7, knight g5, knight c3, bc3, bishop d5, black's up a pawn, and he's much better. So instead of knight c3 with the gambit, white can also play knight d2, try to more directly get the pawn back here. When we play bishop d5, they take on c4, and we just play e6, and black's doing fine here. So I think this is pretty simple to play against this e3 move, but the big question is why play something else, for example knight c3 or c3. Against c3, the very natural move knight c6 after e3 would just transpose back into the normal line system, which is totally fine for black. But the only way to really keep white out of book here is to play queen b6. White really has two moves, queen c2 and queen b3. Pretty much nobody plays queen c2, but black we can just take, and We don't want to take on d4 because white has this threat here. So knight c6 blocks that threat. e3, bishop f5. And of course, as always true, if white takes, we take on b2. Now queen b3, and this endgame is great for black. Or not great, but it's at least equal, and black may be slightly better. If queen a4, there's an interesting shot here with e5, opening up the bishop for an attack on white's king. So for example, if they take, we could take on b2, and we see that black is just collapsing on white here. So queen c2 is fine for white, but really they're probably going to play queen b3, when we cannot play c4, because after queen c2, white's going to push for e4, and black does not have bishop f5. For example, without the knight having moved, they have a checkmate. So c4 is not good because we don't have bishop f5. So instead, I think here we should just take on b3, which is not the most exciting thing in the world, but I think black's doing great. So for example, taking, knight c6, we develop, e6, we keep developing, and we're going to go bishop d7, f6 at some point, bishop b4, and black's going to be fine. So we can just follow the line. Knight f3, bishop d7, knight c3, bishop b4, bishop d3, knight d7, castling f6, h3. White has some ideas maybe of playing knight b5 to hit d6 and a7. So we played knight c8 to cover that. And then, for example, knight b5, king f7, and black's totally fine. So let's show one more line in this variation. So for example, e3, e6, bishop b5, hitting the knight. We can play bishop d7, knight c3, knight f6, h4, a6, knight f3, bishop b4, castling, and now knight e5 is kind of a fun move to hit this pawn, protected by the bishop. Knight e2 defends the pawn, rook ac8 hits the knight again, h5, h6 to stop the attack on the king side, g4, and now knight h7 fully stops that attack, and black is doing fine. One other interesting thing is that here, taking, white can try to gambit the pawn with knight f3, get a lot of activity. For example, if we took knight c3, we see the knight's coming to b5 very quickly. Black really has no development. So after knight f3, we can just play knight c6, keep developing, declining the gambit, and it's the same sort of story here. Bishop d7, bishop b4, develop the pieces, and black is totally fine. So we've looked at e3 and c3. So what else could white try here? They can try taking the pawn and knight c3. So if they take the pawn, e6, there's two moves, e4 and b4. So we can start with e4, very natural. We want to avoid the IQP, and we can take, hit the bishop, bishop g3, taking on c5. Black's totally fine. This is very similar to the Tarrasch French, where black is doing great, and black has even more development here than in that line. So I think black's doing great here. After e6, white can also try b4, which is a little more interesting, trying to hold on to the pawn, challenging black. We can play queen f6 with the fork. They take our knight, we take their rook. Bishop g3 gets the bishop from being attacked. Queen a2, knight f3, knight f6, e3, and bishop e7. And black does have to be careful here, but he's at the exchange and should be winning. Finally, in this position, if white plays knight c3, black plays knight c6. If we took on d4, like in the other lines, queen d4, white attacks d5, e6 defends that. Now white has a nice move here, bishop b8, hitting the knight, stopping black from playing knight c6. And after rook b8, e4, I think white's slightly better here with much more activity. It's definitely playable as black, but there's a much easier choice. After knight c3, we can simply play knight c6. Now if white plays e3, it's exactly the same as before. We're going to take, play a6 to stop knight b5, knight f3, developing, bishop g4. For example, if white blocked bishop f5 with bishop d3, again we're going to take on d4. And here, instead of taking h7, white can try taking on a6. We can play knight c2, knight c6, but the simplest move is rook a6, queen d4, hitting d5, e6, knight f3, knight e7, f6, and king f7, when black's fine. So that's bishop d3. When Most normal for white is to play knight f3, allowing bishop g4, bishop e2, e6, castling, bishop d6, as we've seen before. Now if white plays knight e5, we take on e2, and then we take with the bishop on e5, because if we took with the knight, this bishop feels a little misplaced. So it's a lot more logical to take with the bishop here, and after taking knight e7, black has no bad pieces, and it's slightly better. And I'm just going to show two more things from here. So knight b5 is a horrible blunder, because after queen a5 check, we win the knight. And the very natural move for white here is taking on c5, which hits d5. It seems a little uncomfortable for black to play. However, black can just play e5 here. And white's best move is to retreat meekly with bishop d2. If, queen d5, we take on f4, of course. Bishop d2, bishop c5, and black's doing great. Instead of bishop d2, white's going to probably play bishop g3, which is a mistake, because black gets a huge attack after d4, knight e4, f5 hits the knight, knight d6 check, bishop d6, and then f4 wins the bishop. And of course, white doesn't have to play knight e4, but if they go back, black's are clearly much better with the whole center and more development. Yeah, so that's what I'm suggesting against the London. Very simple, we just take the pawn if we can.